Hey there folks, so welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today I'm currently in Winston-Salem. But before we get to the main event, the album you've all been waiting for, let's knock through a couple other records that I've been meaning to talk about for some time now. This particular one's been on my plate for the past couple of months. How about that self-titled debut record from Bedouine that's been getting all the critical acclaim, shall we? Ugh, man alive, I really wish I could have liked this more, because this really is music that I actually have a fondness for. It's got that warm, a little bit more organic and expressive sort of alt-country, borderline folk sound with a lot of the guitars and strings that come through, some of the organ pickups, and the woman's voice is very weathered and mature sounding. You can tell she's a little bit more world-weary, and that fits with the songwriting. And you know what? A lot of these tunes, they are not bad. I like the textures on display. Sure, it's coffee house music, but it's pretty damn good coffee house music. The problem is that almost after every single time I've listened to this album, I don't remember it at all. Maybe it's a factor of the lyrics not quite being as distinctive as they should be at this point in order to sell the emotion on these songs, or maybe it's a factor of just, I don't know, the songs aren't there in the same way. She doesn't quite have them yet. And maybe it's just like a vocal thing, I can't tell. But overall, thinking maybe a strong 6 out of 10. I know there is an audience for this, it's just not me at this point. It happens. Well, how about we move on to something else? How about that Brett Eldredge record, that self-titled record that dropped a little bit earlier this year? A little bit more rollicking, per se.
I can't change the world, no, I can't change a flag. You can give me your heart, girl, well, you may never get it back. You said you'd never smile again, but I don't know, here it comes, would you look at that? I finally found something I'm good at.
Okay, so here's a confession. I've always kind of liked Brett Eldredge. I like his voice, I like that he's a little bit more creative than your typical male bro country artist. Hell, I wouldn't even call him bro country. He kind of fell a little bit towards the thing with his 2015 album, but he always showed a little bit more ideas in his production style and in a lot of his writing, and he does have a very distinctive voice. I was pretty hard then on that 2015 record when it didn't quite deliver as consistently as it could have, and thus when it came back in 2017, I almost wasn't going to cover this. Thankfully I did, because this is actually a pretty solid record, shows him regaining a little bit more of his sea legs. Again, I like this guy's voice. I wish he stuck a little bit more with his baritone, because I think there's a lot of richness there that he doesn't quite capitalize on as much as he could. I don't know why he goes into falsetto, but I guess that's popular around this time. And again, he's the sort of guy that kind of reminds me of a new generation of Brad Paisley. He's looser, he's a little bit goofier, and he plays into it. He's maybe not quite as corny as Brad Paisley is, but he doesn't have the guitar chops either, but at the same time, it's likable, it's charming, it's kind of personal. He's going to get a little bit more vulnerable. He's not quite as standoffish as Brad Paisley can be, and that definitely plays pretty well to some of his more emotive tracks on this album. I guess the downside with it is that it's not always consistent. Again, he's got some of his sea legs at this point, but his instrumentation can definitely lean towards the overproduced, especially in the percussion lines. I do wish that he opted for a little bit more subtlety. Big and goofy can only take you so far, especially as some of these songs can feel a little bit one-dimensional. That Caribbean-inspired beach song had no business being on this record. But overall, it is an improvement. I do wish that his subject matter got a little bit more serious, but if he's gonna stick with big and goofy for at least one project until he gets a little bit more stable, this is a good way to do it. And again, the industry likes this guy, so he's gonna stick around, and as it is, solid 6 out of 10. If you're a fan, it's worth checking out. And now on to something that I've gotten a lot of requests for. Probably should have covered when I was back in Nashville, given that I covered his father's record in Nashville. Let's talk about that newest record from Lukas Nelson and The Promise of the Real.
I'll forget about Georgia, 'cause she'll never love me like I know love's supposed to be. Each night I pray I'll forget about Georgia, but a part of me hopes that she'll never forget about me.
So, okay, for those of you who do not know, Lukas Nelson is actually the son of Willie Nelson, and he's had his own country rock, southern rock band for the past decade now. And honestly, they're a pretty good band, playing more of the Allman Brothers 70s and 80s type of sound, with rich, layered guitar leads and pretty good solos, firmer, textured bass lines, and really some more interesting percussion than you would otherwise expect. They're a pretty solid group. They even actually got political on one of their projects. Now, for their newest record, which is effectively their self-titled album, they went in more of a country direction, more specifically the indie country soul sound that you're getting from a lot like Chris Stapleton. And you know what, that's not a bad fit. They even got Lady Gaga on backing vocals, and she's uncredited, but still, that's an impressive find. The frustrating thing, though, is that maybe they shouldn't have been listening to Traveler as much as they were, because for as much as Lukas Nelson sounds like his father, he's not Chris Stapleton. He doesn't really have that bellowing power, and thus when he's trying to sing opposite Lady Gaga, he just is a little bit outclassed at this point. His voice doesn't quite have that depth and soul to really back up these compositions. Now don't get me wrong, when it gets down to more stripped back, more acoustic leaning singer-songwriter type material, he's doing quite well, especially with the album's greater, more refined focus on maturity, especially when it comes to those relationships. And you know what, that's not a bad thing at all, especially when it comes to how he presents it. He's not his father in terms of emotive power in his voice, but who is? At the same time though, I'm not quite certain the focus, or really the lack thereof, on this album is really there. It can get a little bit exasperating the number of times I have gone through this record and it just kind of feels scatterbrained and all over the place, not really sticking to a coherent theme. Some good individual songs, sure, but not really enough all the way through. So as a whole, I'm giving this a very strong 6 out of 10. There is a recommendation for this, especially if you're into the sound, but they aren't really innovating the same way. They're really adapting a sound that's been done better elsewhere, and while there are a couple gems, really not as a whole. I see there's an audience for this completely, but again, I've heard this done better. But now on to the main event. Let's talk about that newest record from The War on Drugs called A Deeper Understanding.
Am I just living in the space between the beauty and the pain? In the real thing.
I gotta be honest, folks, this is easily one of my most anticipated projects of 2017, especially after Lost in the Reel. Their 2014 record made my top 5 best albums of that respective year. Now that's not saying I wasn't a little bit concerned, because after all, they had signed with Atlantic. That's a major label. You had to question how much creative control they would end up ceding, and the good news is that they didn't end up ceding much at all. In terms of a lot of the tones and sounds they brought to the table, much of this is very much standard War on Drugs material, except, you know, made a little bit bigger, made a little less hazy, giving a little bit more clarity to those synthesizers and guitar leads. And while some can say that will compromise some of the atmosphere, and yeah, I'm kind of one of those people, and we'll get into that a bit later, at the same time, still the core of War on Drugs is here. The synthesizer layers that glitter against that beautiful layers of guitar that come in as well, all with so much tone that just is perfectly picked up there. And then you have the deep thrumming bass lines and low synths, the percussion that holds to that groove, and then Adam Granducio's vocals just cutting through with that odd blend of Springsteen and Dylan that anything is more clear than ever. That's one thing I will give Atlantic credit for. If they're going to be able to make the vocals and the lyrics that much more audible, I appreciate that. But really, the reason you go to listen to a War on Drugs record, the accent moments, the guitar solos that just surge up at the best possible time. You realize each note is precisely timed and placed in order to emphasize and maximize that emotion. And go even further, you go down to some of the harmonica pieces that come in at exactly the right time to emphasize that heartland Americana feel. And go even further, some of the saxophone, you can tell he's been listening to the E Street Band, and yet I'm not going to complain at all. It sounds beautiful. And it's very telling that for the War on Drugs, this is probably their longest record to date. It goes over an hour on 10 songs, and yet it doesn't feel like there's a wasted moment. For as many records that go this long on such long songs, and yet for the compositions to feel as economical and developed as they do, that says a lot. Now I will say, just to break this off a little bit, that I do wish some of the little bit more of the haze had come forward in some of the guitar tones, a little bit more of that lo-fi roughness had cut through, because that was always something I liked about the War on Drugs. I'm able to intensify that atmosphere. And I'm not quite certain there are the same gigantic crescendos that work so well on songs like Red Eyes, or just that absolutely awe-inspiring moment that we got on In Reverse 3 years ago. But at the same time, you have a lot of these songs that will grow on you in the same way, and I can easily see a number of tracks from this list making the year-end list. Of course, though, it also comes back to the lyrics, and it does feel like whereas the last album was a little bit more coaxed in depression and coming out of a darker scene, this album is not. It's a little bit more contemplative, a little bit more calculated in being able to think through these situations, trying to ask those deeper questions when it comes to himself and with respect to relationships and all the girls that are observed that are cloaked in moonlight on distant roads. You get a lot of sense of mist that cuts through the album the most. Noticeable connections that are captured in a mix that is so broad and expansive, calling to mind that wistful melancholy and a love that can span across it. Whether it even works or not, coming the maturity comes in realizing that, coming to that deeper understanding of where that love might eventually trace. And yeah, if you've been paying attention at all, this is very much along the lines of a similar arc that came on the last album. But it does feel a little bit more developed here. It doesn't feel as frenetic, which can be a blessing and a curse at some points. I think the better moments on this album overall are more consistent. So it's a little tough for me to say which one is better. Although I will say that there are points where I wish that there was a little bit more of that frenetic atmosphere, because when this record gets kicking, it kicks ass. I just wish that it got to those points a little bit more. Didn't quite feel as deliberate as this one does. But you know what? There is something about this music that speaks to the middle-aged man buried deep inside of me. I'll have to admit that this sort of Americana heartland music is just right up my alley. This is a tone and sound that works wonders. The melodies are phenomenal. For driving music, you're not going to find a record better this year. And yeah, I'm thinking it's a 9 out of 10. It's one of the best albums of the year. It's already gotten this level of critical acclaim, and by God, it deserves it. But until then, I got a few more reviews left before I'm heading home, and I'm currently staying at the house of a friend. I'm gonna have some more videos coming out from that. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.